It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, as always, that means some smart talk radios in your future, and this segment should be an interesting one indeed. Going to talk a little business here, but has applications for everybody, whether you're in private business or not. We're going to be talking to Bryce Hoffman. He's the best-selling author, speaker, and consultant, and he helps companies around the globe plan better and global leaders lead better by applying innovative systems from the world of business and the military. He's the author of the 2012 bestseller American Icon, Alan Mulally, and The Fight to Save Ford Motor Company. Should be an interesting concept and conversation indeed. Bryce, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, Warner. How are you?
Well, we're good, and we're very pleased to have you here. We want to talk about a work called Red Teaming, how your business can conquer the competition by challenging everything. Why don't you share with our Lewis at Large listeners across Northeast Kansas a little bit about your background?
Sure, Warner. Well, I was a journalist for 22 years, a financial journalist, and I covered the .com industry, the biotech industry, and the automobile industry. And what I learned during that time is that success is a very poor teacher for companies, because when they're successful, they start to take their success for granted. And that's really what went wrong with the American automobile industry, and it's what's starting to go wrong in other industries. So I started looking for a system that would help companies not take their success for granted, but continue to stress test their strategies and plans and make sure that they were as good for tomorrow as they were for yesterday. And I found that system in all places at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas.
Close to here. And speaking of close to here, Alan Mulally is actually from Lawrence, Kansas.
That's right. He is indeed. Native son. And, the U.S. Army has created this incredible program called Red Teaming, and they developed it after they ran into trouble in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they were determined to not make the same mistakes in the future that they made in the past. And so they set up a school at Fort Leavenworth to teach this revolutionary new approach to strategic planning and decision-making. That's all about helping organizations stress test their strategies, make better decisions, and cut through the groupthink and that sort of thing, and get at the truth that is within their company, within their organizations. I went there. I spent the first half of 2015 in beautiful Kansas learning about this system, and then I've been spending the past couple of years figuring out how to port it to business, and the result is what I described in my new book, Red Teaming.
I'm curious as to, as you went around and you talked to business leaders, is this something that would be innate with them, or is this really pretty much at the time, at least prior to this, strictly inside the military?
That's a great question, Warner. And, every business leader that I've shared Red Teaming with has been amazed by it. And they've been amazed at the cutting-edge thinking that's coming out of the military, coming out of Fort Leavenworth, because there is nothing like this in business. Some of the most innovative companies, and I mean companies like Google, like Amazon, they do things like this organically. They do these. They have a kind of contrarian bent that they use to challenge everything they do, to question everything they do, and to try constantly to do what they do better. But most companies have nothing like this, and certainly no company has such a formal system as the one the military has developed. And that's what makes this so effective, Warner, is it's a system that companies of any size can adopt, can learn about, and can use to make better decisions, to make better plans, to make their strategies better, and as I say in the book, to become one of the disruptors in their industry rather than one of the disrupted.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, let's dive a little bit deeper into Red Teaming. Give us some, I don't know whether it's concepts or strategies or bullet points from there so we can start to understand it a little better.
Well, Red Teaming is really based on the research that's been done over the past few decades into cognitive psychology and human decision-making. People like Dr. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, and other folks who've been looking at how individuals and organizations make decisions. And what they've discovered, Warner, is that no matter how smart we are, no matter how well educated we all have blind spots. We all have biases. We all succumb to groupthink and to as I said, success sometimes makes us blind to new ideas because we think it's worked in the past. Why shouldn't it work in the future? So let me give you an example of how that plays out in the business world. Blockbuster was approached by Netflix early on, and Netflix offered to sell itself to Blockbuster for $50 million. Not just once, Warner, but 2 or 3 times the head of Netflix Reed Hastings went down to Blockbuster's headquarters and offered to sell his company to Blockbuster for $50 million. And you know what happened each time? They literally got laughed out of the room. Now, we all know what happened to Blockbuster, and we all know what happened to Netflix. It wasn't because the executives at Blockbuster were stupid that they passed on that opportunity. It was because their success to date had blinded them to the fact that there was a new way of doing business that was going to eat their lunch. And we see that sort of thing happening every day right now, Warner. Every day, some new Uber emerges somewhere in the world and eats somebody's lunch. And this system, red teaming, is designed to help avoid that, to help you become one of the disruptors, one of the people who's eating the lunch rather than one that's eaten. That's happened to the U.S. military, too, in Iraq. They had a lot of assumptions. We won the war very easily, but the peace proved a lot harder and a lot harder to hold. And so they were forced to adapt and come up with this system as a way of making sure that they didn't take their success for granted going forward.
What on this new kinds of thinking? We certainly know that currently in the news, there's all kinds of retailers that are just falling to the wayside, one after another, as this sort of new paradigm kind of emerges. I know that red teaming is a lot more than just dealing with things online versus offline, but also, how would it work in a smaller company? Let's just say even a small local retailer, or a small coffee shop, or a small advertising agency somewhere.
That's a great question. You brought up the large retailers, Warner, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there is not a brick and mortar retailer in this country, whether they're a mom and pop or whether they're Macy's, that isn't fighting right now for their life, whether they know it or not, because the online retail industry is disrupting everything. And so the way that red teaming helps, and in fact, I just wrote a piece a few weeks ago on Forbes about the situation at Macy's and Sears that speaks directly to this point. The way red teaming helps is that rather than spend your time reacting to these competitors who've got the drop on you, it's better to take the time to look at your own strategy and plan and see if there's a way to do what you're doing better, to stop doing the same old thing over and over again. When Macy's started to get into trouble, I'm sure all your listeners who've ever been in a Macy's know what I'm going to say next. When they started to get in trouble, what did they do? They just started printing more coupons, right? They started printing more coupons, sending out more mailers, having more sales, to the point that every time you walked into Macy's, there was a sale going on. That didn't work because it was just doing the same thing over and over again. And we all know that the classic definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. But businesses do that every day. So to stop yourself from doing the same thing over and over again, you need to use a system that makes you take a step back and look at it critically, look at it objectively, look at it like a competitor would look at what you're doing. That's what red teaming does. And it can work, as I said, for a small individual enterprise. It can work for a global corporation.
Well, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, talking to Bryce Hoffman. He is a best-selling author, consultant to numerous businesses around the globe. He's also the author of the 2012 bestseller American Icon, Alan Mulally and the Fight to Save Ford Motor Company, talking about a brand new work called Red Teaming, how your business can conquer the competition by challenging everything. Bryce, what about for our friends out there that lead just organizations or nonprofit groups? How would this apply into their organization as well?
Well, Warner, that's a great question. One of the most effective red teaming engagements that the Army has ever done actually involved a nonprofit, involved the Gates Foundation. So the Gates Foundation, as most of your listeners will be aware, had been very successful at eradicating polio around the world. But the last 1% of polio cases were just stubbornly defying all of their best efforts to eradicate them. And so someone who had worked with USAID, who'd been through the U.S. Army's program at Fort Leavenworth, had the idea when she was working with the Gates Foundation of asking the Army if they could come in and help. And so they sent a red team from Fort Leavenworth to Seattle to work with the Gates Foundation on this polio question. And when they got there, Warner, the situation they found was that the folks who were running the polio program at the Gates Foundation were proposing just spending more money doing the same thing they'd already done, just upping the amount of dollars they were throwing at the problem, because what they had done had worked up until this last 1%. So surely if you just kept swinging hammer harder, you were bound to break through. Not at all. What the Army discovered is that the reason why this last 1% of cases was so stubbornly resisting their efforts was because, and they were almost all in India, was because of two factors that had nothing to do, that weren't being addressed by the existing polio eradication programs. One, most of these cases were in rural Muslim communities in India, and most of the medical workers who were giving the vaccine were men. So they were going to during the day, knocking on the doors of houses where there were just women at home with their children and asking if they could come in. Well, that's not acceptable in that culture. So the Army recommended replacing those with female field workers to deliver the vaccine. That was point one. Point two was they were trying really hard to get the Indian government to help them with this program. What they found is that in a country with over 1 billion people and many of whom are living in abject poverty, they weren't really too big of a hurry to eradicate the rest of the polio cases, because it wasn't actually a problem in their mind if a bunch of poor people's kids died. So they reoriented their approach to send in female health workers and to circumvent the Indian government and go directly to the local community leaders. And guess what? They almost entirely eradicated polio.
Well, you're actually sort of a graduate, and you went through this training in 2015, where you graduated from the U.S. Army's
That's
Red
right.
Team deal in Fort Leavenworth. Who developed it, so to speak, or how did this evolve within the military?
That's a great question. You know, some of the ideas about that red teaming draws on have been around for a while, but modern red teaming, modern decision support red teaming in the Army was really the product of a lessons learned team that was set up in 2004 by the Secretary of the Army. At that point, if you cast your mind back, things were already starting to go south for us in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so the Secretary of the Army, when he took over, he set up this team to find out how could we avoid making these mistakes again. And one of the groups that was created as part of this was headed by a colonel out there at Fort Leavenworth, Colonel Steve Rotkoff. And he suggested, he had been the number 2 intelligence guy during the invasion of Iraq, and he suggested that we take this kind of critical thinking approach, this contrarian approach, to kind of have a second set of eyes, look at our strategies, look at our plans, and have a critical discussion of them before we sign off on them. He kind of helped, he with some other officers, including another colonel out there in Kansas, Colonel Greg Fontenot, ended up putting together this program, stood up informally was called Red Team University. Officially, it was the University of Foreign Military and Cultural Studies. They called it that because initially they didn't want any of our adversaries to know what it was all about. And that's still operating at Fort Leavenworth today, and it has become the gold standard of red teaming worldwide, to the point that other countries, when they want to adopt red teaming, and believe me, every one of our allied countries that's learned about it has seen how successful it's been, has wanted to adopt it. They all send their officers to Fort Leavenworth to learn how to red team, and so do other government agencies even. So do the Marines, so does the Navy, the Air Force. Everybody sends their people to Fort Leavenworth to learn how it's done.
What was the most eye-opening thing as you went through this red teaming training and experience? What was eye-opening for you? There
were a lot of different things that were eye-opening for me, Warren. one of them, honestly, was my classmates. I was privileged to be in a class with a bunch of majors, all of whom were combat veterans, served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I was so impressed to see the caliber of leaders that these men and women were. I mean, these were people, I worked with a lot of companies all over the world, and these were people who could step out of their uniform and walk into the C-suite of any company in the world tomorrow and contribute and be an effective leader. So that was one thing that really I was really surprised by. The other thing, though, was just the red teaming education. I mean, I tell you, I felt like I learned more in the 3 months I spent at Fort Leavenworth than I learned in all my years of college. And you know what? Every single one of my classmates felt the same way, because this approach it really makes you think about how you think individually and the decisions you make as an individual. Because one of the things that you spend a lot of time studying there is all the ways that our minds kind of play tricks on us. I mean, I'm sure you and all of your listeners can think of at least one time when you've made a decision that seemed like the best idea in the world, and then a few days later you looked back and said, how could I have been so stupid? Does that ever happen to you, Warner?
Never. I've never second-guessed myself.
But, you know, that happens to all of us.
Many times.
And it happens to all of us, again, no matter how smart we are, no matter how well-educated we are. And so learning about the ways that happens, which was a big part of what we learned there, was really eye-opening to me. So you identify these things. You know, for instance, there's a lot of these things that have been identified by psychologists. For instance, confirmation bias. We tend to listen more, and this has been proved time and time again. We tend to listen more to information that confirms what we already believe than information that challenges what we believe. And so that's true of politics, but it's also true of business. So if we think we've cracked the code in our business, let me give you an example, another real-world example. Most people don't realize this, but Polaroid, back in the 1990s, was actually a leader in digital photography. They had one of the best-selling consumer digital cameras on the market. And their senior leadership team, I kid you not, had a meeting where they discussed whether to invest more in digital cameras or to double down on their film business. And the decision that they made when they looked at the problem was that, yeah, this digital camera stuff was pretty cool, and they were growing their share of the market, but they were making so much more money off of film than digital cameras that they decided to kill their digital camera division so they could focus on film. Now, in retrospect, that has got to be one of the stupidest decisions that has ever been made in the history of business. And as we all know, Polaroid went bankrupt. But those were not stupid people. They were listening to the information that confirmed what they already knew. For one thing, they also were falling victim to another big bias we all suffer from called loss aversion, which is a bias that makes us more worried about losing something than we are about gaining something. So they were more worried about losing their profitable film business than they were gaining a new business that had a future. We all make these types of mistakes, and red teaming is how we avoid it.
What about just overall, in terms of this whole thing of red teaming? Are you finding more and more companies are officially adopting this? And if they're adopting it, is it called red teaming, or are there other names for this, the same process?
So this is very new, Warner. I mean, this is not something that's been out there. The companies that I've introduced this to, I haven't worked with one that hasn't immediately seen the value in it and adopted it. And they are calling it red teaming. So the point that you go into companies that I've worked with 3 or 4 months later and you see people talking about, we need to red team this decision, we need to red team this plan. But there are companies out there, some of the most disruptive, some of the most successful companies in the world today, companies like Google, companies like Amazon, that do things like this organically. They don't call it red teaming, they don't have a formal system for doing it, but they do much the same thing because that's in their DNA, and that's how they become so successful, and that's how they become such a threat to other companies. You know, you look at this just in the past few days, Amazon's announced it's getting in the furniture business. There is not a furniture store in this country, whether it's a mom and pop or a national chain, that should not be shaking in their shoes right now at that news. that Amazon is getting in the furniture business. But the reason why that's so frightening is because Amazon is looking at the furniture business differently. That's what they do. It's part of their culture. You know, I'll tell you honestly, when I heard about red teaming, it sounded like a great idea to me, but I didn't trust myself. I wanted to make sure that other people thought so too. So I called some friends of mine at different companies whose opinions I trusted and asked them what they thought of it. And one of them was a senior executive at Amazon. And when I described the Army's program to him, he said, you know, Bryce, this sounds a lot like how we do things at Amazon. We take and we look at how a business is run, and then we ask ourselves, how could we blow that up? How could we do that differently? What's a better way of doing that? And that's why they're able to come and disrupt all these industries. That's why furniture stores should be so scared. And that's why companies need to use a system like red teaming if they're not already doing something like that themselves.
A lot of people, business people, will say, you know, we really don't want to focus on what the competition's doing. We're really focusing on what we're doing and trying to execute what we do. This is clearly a blend of both.
Absolutely. I mean, this is about looking inwards and looking outwards. So red teaming does a few things. One, it makes your plan stronger by looking for the weaknesses in them. The way it works at the simplest level, Warner, is that red teaming takes your strategy or your plan and it breaks it down into the assumptions it's based on, the stated assumptions and the unstated assumptions, because all plans are based on assumptions. And then it challenges those assumptions to make sure they're really true and that they're likely to remain true regardless of what happens in the broader business environment. And if they're not, then red teaming includes a series of tools that are designed to help adjust the plan to account for that. And if it can't be adjusted, then you need to rethink the plan. But at the same time, it also includes a set of tools and techniques to help you understand how your competitors are likely to view your plan, how they're likely to react to it, that sort of thing. So it's about looking outwards and inwards at the same time.
Well, it's a fascinating concept, not new to the military, but certainly new but growing as a concept in American business and other organizations. The work is called Red Teaming, How Your Business Can Conquer the Competition by Challenging Everything, but that also goes for nonprofits as well, I'm sure. Our guest has been Bryce G. Hoffman, again, best-selling author, and you've seen him on TV, radio for sure. He also speaks around the country and works with dozens of countries around the world. Bryce, how can people find out more about red teaming and maybe pick up a copy of the book and some of the other work you've done?
The book goes on sale today, Tuesday, and it is available online and in bookstores everywhere. And you can also go to my website, www.brycehoffman.com, or you can go to Red Team Thinking, all one word, redteamthinking.com.
Well, we appreciate you spending time today with us. I know you're on a very busy schedule and would love to have you back again, and thanks so much for your insights.
Thank you, Warner. Really enjoyed speaking with you.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.